سيداتي وسادتي، ستبدأ الآن الجلسة الأولى تحت عنوان عالمنا اليوم: تنافس، تنازع، تفكك. Ladies and gentlemen, panel 1 entitled What World Are We Living In? Competition, Contestation, Fragmentation will start now.
We're okay? The mics? They're working?
No, you're on. Hello.
Yeah, of course I'll do that. Sabah al-khair. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be back again in ADSD 11th anniversary. And allow me at the beginning to extend my gratitudes and thankfuls to Dr. Abtisam Al-Kitbi, the president of EPC, for keeping the great work and bringing the best minds to discuss the issues of our time. Thank you, Dr. Abtisam, and thanks to EPC. And I'm delighted today, extra delighted, to be joined by fantastic, outstanding experts and speakers to discuss a very simple question. It's actually easy to the extent I can't think of any questions to raise. And it's about what world we are living in. Tell me if this is not a simple, direct, easy questions. Well, the most important questions are simple and easy. The challenge is to find simple solutions and answers to them. And I'm joined today by these minds in order to try to answer that questions. And before providing ideas about the world itself and the competing explanations of what kind of world we're living in, whether it's great competitions, great power competitions, the back of it, the return of it, contestations of values and norms and ideological divides, or a fragmented type of world, I want to invite my speakers, after I introduce them, to describe the world we live in their own way of thinking and understanding, in a word or in a sentence. And I'm delighted to start introducing His Excellency Jon Alterman from CSIS. Of course, Jon is known for what he is, the expertise he can always bring to the table and to the international discussions. So, Jon, the question is for you. In a word or a sentence, what world we living in?
I think thank you very much, Zaid, for having me. Thanks to Dr. Ibtisam. It's a real honor to be here. I remember being in my office and she told me she had this idea to start a think tank. And I think what you've done is just so remarkable with the debate with the think tank, so congratulations. I think that the title this year, A World in Flux, captures so much. When I was on the policy planning staff of the State Department, they talked about moving to the post-Cold War world. Now we're in the post-Cold War world, economically, politically, diplomatically, technologically. the world is at an unprecedented inflection point.
Yeah, John, this is much more than one word or sentence. Thank you. So it's a flux.
Flux is my word.
Okay, thanks. Now, Mr. Samir, of course, Samir, we're very delighted to have you, president of the Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in India. So we agreed for you to say only one word, not even a sentence.
Look, I think 2 words should suffice. There's clearly a moment of reckoning. So I would use the world is at that moment of reckoning. We have some responses that we need to produce. And I would also say rejuvenation. Many regions are actually now reaching new heights. So it's reckoning and rejuvenation at the same time.
Interesting. That's your way. And of course, we're delighted to have our distinguished scholar from China, who's in Geneva Graduate Schools, Professor Qiang, who asked me to say that word. In your own words, how you describe the world?
Dangerous.
Not for us.
Yes, well, I think it's dangerous for 2 reasons. One is there is a major Cold War is unfolding, but not just a Cold War, because the real Cold War, there is a mechanism for maintaining stability. Now we don't even have a mechanism at all for maintaining stability among the major powers. So that's what I'm talking about. Danger is more like pre-1914 rather than the first Cold War. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'll actually stay with you and stick to continue this conversation, if you allow me. And I'm going to pick up from where you left. So it's a dangerous word because of the nature of distribution of power, the nature of powers itself and who holds in these power, or because of the very, very dividing ideological lines between those who are having power. So what makes it dangerous?
Well, I really don't think there is a major ideological clash. This is a Cold War, I believe 2.0, chosen by the West. I'm talking about United States. It's not necessity. I think it's a choice. I guess the reason for American make that decision, to me, it's very simple. There are 2 things Americans were obsessed. One is their own domestic, social, economic, maybe even more serious racial crisis. There is always a need when a country is deeply into a crisis. In this case, of course, the United States is divided right in the middle. We haven't seen that situation since Abraham Lincoln time. So the second point, therefore, because of the crisis, there is a need for externalize its domestic crisis, exporting its domestic crisis. I guess this is the main driver behind this. Besides, of course, the other side, we talk about China, Russia, and others, also reacted in the way they believe it's a rational reaction, but sometimes also not quite rational. So we are talking about this situation today similar to pre-1914. It's because the great powers today fail to correct messaging what they really want or the signaling what they want. This is where the real danger is. This is where a Sarajevo could trigger a major crisis. Okay. So that's what worries me. Yes.
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting. I find it hard to agree on the comparison between the situation and pre-1914, but I think lack of some clarity is absolutely prevailing, and that might cause a lot of problems. I'll bring it back to you, John, and the overlapping ideas of this conference, as I've seen it in the brochure of APC, it's about this illusion of stability which actually caused by a world in flux, as it's said and as you described it, which makes us dangerous, and also as Samir has described it correctly. But also there is an assumption that the world actually is moving to be multipolars, but with this multipolar system, there is a kind of new dynamics, including the minilateral is more important than multilateral. That's the regionalism. And also swing states, middle power and swing states are playing much more role than we used to know before. So what do you make out of that? How does that sound and looks to you?
I mean, you're right that the assumption that there are just 2 or 3 poles in the world clearly is breaking down. I think from an American perspective, most Americans seriously underestimate American power, American influence. I think sometimes that misunderestimation creates strange behaviors.
Yeah.
But we're still going to have to get used to how the world operates according to more ad hoc relationships, fewer clear rules, fewer expectations. People will misjudge, and that will create conflict. And I think that, as I said at the very beginning, there is something technological going on. There is something social and economic going on, and how the international system absorbs those kinds of changes strikes me as something people haven't completely grappled with. What kind of world China wants, I think it's a little bit unclear. What kind of world the United States is willing to invest in is similarly unclear, especially after the last election. So I think we're in a period of profound uncertainty.
Well, this is amazing, and I can't but agree. It's uncertainty. It's absolutely true. And what strikes me is what world we're living in, or what world great power wants to see or to create or to invest in, as if it's a matter of a choice. And Professor was saying it's a matter of a choice. And that brings the role of leadership and the decisive role different leaders play in deciding the course of actions in different countries and powers. But I'll get back to that after I bring it back to Samir to pick up his brain on that. And from your perspective, Samir, if we need to reimagine the world, or as composed of a few major powers, and the relation between these major powers that will make the nature of the world politics. So how you describe it? Who are these powers? Where the power resides? And how they are interacting with each other? And this interactions constitute what? And then I'll come back to the rules-based systems and all of this, literature on that.
So first of all, let me also join in and congratulate Ebtisam for this wonderful platform she's invested into and built, where literally you can see a diversity that is unmatched in most other arenas. This is not an echo chamber. This is anti-echo chamber conference. So I think well done, Ebtisam. We have built a diverse forum here. On your question, I think there are some easy responses to your question. So obviously, like I think both the previous speakers have mentioned, the US-China interaction, dynamic engagement is important. What does President Trump do in terms of that particular relationship, which has till now, by the way, seen a bipartisan consensus? Getting tough on China is now a US consensus from both parties. So what does Donald Trump do? Does he ratchet up the pressure, or does he find a new entente or a detente with China that eases the levels of tension? I think that's one easy bilateral that's important. The second, of course, because of the conflict in Europe, there has to be a US-Russia conversation. At some point, US and Russia will have to find an agreement in the continent. Europe is not capable of doing it, let's be honest. It is a US-Russia conversation that will lead to the closure of the Ukraine conflict. And till now, US has delegated it to the lesser actors in Europe, but at some point, US will have to take back that conversation, and maybe Donald Trump might actually think of fashioning some sort of a peace deal in the coming months in Europe. So that's the second dynamic, and it's important. But I think the most important relationship that is ignored by all of us, because we somehow have an easy assumption that it is consistent and constant, is the European-American relationship. And I think what is really up for grabs for the future of the world order is the transatlantic partnership. I think it is the fragility that is creeping into that relationship that might actually undo much of the stability of the world order as was fashioned in the last century. It was the transatlantic relationship that defined the world order as we know it. And if that relationship has ruptures or in some sense reaches a snapping point on some instances, for example, if the Europeans say we are not going to follow the American lead on China relationship, it's a big possibility. The fact is that there are many European countries that are still investing in Chinese technologies for their telecommunication network. It's a fact. You have the Germans doubling down on FDI in China and putting more money into the continent.
Right.
German industry is not following German government when it comes to the China relationship. So I think the most important dynamic for the future is the relationship between Europe and America, and it should not be taken for granted. That relationship could change, and certainly could change under Trump, depending on how Trump reaches out to his cousins across the sea. So I think that's the relationship to watch out for. I like our region. I like some of the countries and the way they are approaching the world today. So I like what UAE, Saudi, India, and some others are doing. I think we are adding rationality and stability to a world gone crazy. And in many ways, we are also, in our own economies and societies, seeing a moment of rejuvenation, of new direction, of new growth. So there is also excitement in this region that is also infectious. So sometimes I think more like us could be better for the world. And I think we have a role in stabilizing some of the edges that we are seeing emerge in different parts.
Well, thank you very much, Samir. And it's interesting to focus on. I'm sorry.
I think the other piece is the U.S. relationship, the Indo-Pacific, the U.S.-India relationship is fascinating. The U.S. investing in a different kind of relationship with Japan, Korea. I agree that there's something going on in Europe. I think the way the U.S. is thinking differently about the Indo-Pacific, clearly becoming a strategic focus, is really important. How that affects China and China's desire for domination of Asia, as it had in previous years, I think is an important dynamic to understand.
Well, John, thank you very much for that, because actually I want you to discuss these issues with each other. I just need to facilitate that. So if any one of you have any kind of reactions or comments on, anyone notes, please come in and make your notes. And I'll take it to you, Professor Xiang, because this idea about U.S.-Europe relation being a major marker of future world order and a global system, it's important. Now, we used to think of Europe as being the first strategic priority for the Americans' interest in the last century, in the 20th century. Is it so still? This is the question. And, with this American kind of inconsistencies or confusion, if you wish, about, keeping the old realistic approach to the world, where Europe comes first, or this pivoting strategy where China is the threat. Of course, the easy thing is to say balancing acts between this and that, but I think this is not what captures the Americans' strategies, nor the nature of the world. So, Professor Xiang, in reaction to that and to what's been discussed, what do you think?
Well, on Europe, I live in Europe. Well, what the Europeans are talking every day is, can EU survive the next 10 years or so? I was, 2 days ago, was in Sochi listening to Putin 4 hours, 4.5 hours. I don't agree with him on everything, but at least one thing struck me. He said, what's the problem with the EU, Europe? There was a brain deficit. Well, I guess that is probably the EU problem. They don't know how to get together, really. My view is this about EU. If EU don't continue to pursue what they used to call strategic autonomy, nobody, including China, maybe even the United States, in the long run will not take EU seriously. Now, they abandoned that idea. When von der Leyen came to power as the EU president, she said, I want to be the president of geopolitical autonomy for the EU.
Yeah.
But because the Ukraine and all the other issues, EU basically become, I will say, jackal in a sense, that just follow what Americans trying to do. Fine. If that's their choice, that's fine. But look at what a mess they created so far.
All right. Yeah, Jon.
It strikes me the EU has a problem because it's consensus driven, so it can't really act. So I think that constrains the EU, but European countries have some of the largest economies in the world. We have the educational and economic ties between Americans and Europeans. There's a sort of strategic comfort. I think you're going to see that enduring. The question is how it is complemented by deepening US relations with Asia, whether there's a European accommodation understanding of Asia. It's complicated partly because of colonial reasons and others. But it does strike me that some of the most interesting things are happening in US-India relations, US-Japan relations are being transformed. Is there a way the United States can engage more robustly with Indonesia, and what's Indonesia's regional role? I think that there's sort of this sense of possibility that we're still understanding. And I think one of the things that's also happening is there's a sense in much of the Pacific that China's diplomacy is threatening and countries are looking to balance away from China, and how the United States works with partners and allies to create confidence, to create a sense of security, I think is one of the big challenges that certainly Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell has been working on. How much that is going to be a priority in the Trump administration, I think we still don't understand how the Trump administration is going to think about geopolitics. That the president-elect tends to think about individual relationships. I think he thinks that he understands President Putin, he understands President Xi. How the personal relationships intersect with the kinds of broader strategic changes we're talking about is something that's going to depend partly on personnel and partly on the things that happen over the coming years.
So, Jon, well, thank you very much. This is important because I also want to continue with you to press this issue. So, while people would think at large that there is some kind of the invisible hands that actually creates the world order, the structure of it, in terms of distribution of power and how it works. And yet, we realize that, changing leaders, changing administrations will actually have also a direct impact on the direction of the world itself. And you mentioned Trump. So in your views, this is the reality, this is the real world that we know, and how power is distributed in it, and how different players is seeing their roles and the world around them. And yet comes a new strategy, new foreign policy that deal with the same world, but also take it in different directions. So how that is happening?
Well, I would argue even more importantly that the nature of the world order is predicated on the idea that people have a fairly good expectation of how the United States will act and when the United States will act, and those issues are relatively bounded.
Okay.
The premise of the Trump administration will be that letting people have expectations of US action strengthens others and weakens the United States. And the United States is strongest when people don't know what the US is going to do, and people come and try to influence what the US does. And that's the way the president will be able to extract things from other leaders because they will try to sway his thinking.
Right.
I think that's the near term consequence, that actually US power will grow disproportionately larger. I think the long term is likely that countries who feel they need to hedge against American abandonment, American action. But it seems to me that the question for order is always predicated on understanding in fairly narrow bounds of US preferences, US actions, what the US is willing to invest in. And we are entering a period where the president will work very hard to undermine expectations.
Right.
And keep everybody off balance with the idea that he can determine where to go and extract more advantages for the benefit of the American people.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now, Samir, I'll take it back to you. Now, following the same discussions and debate about this strategic priorities and the role of the U.S. in this new world order and the world order itself, and given the idea that militarization actually has become a new reality in the international relations and the new world order, and a new alliance has been shaped and formed for the last few years, and some of them is flux in itself, some is stable. So from your point of view and from your part of the world, Asia and Asia regional dynamics, how is the world order is playing in Asia and how Asia is shaping the world itself?
This is Asia is very large, so I think it's difficult to really respond from an Asian perspective. But I think different parts of Asia are certainly readjusting their foreign policy and influencing the world order. Let me, for example, give you an ASEAN example, East Asian example. This year, a few months ago, they had a survey where for the first time, more ASEAN countries see China as their first partner and US as the second partner. In fact, 4 out of the 7, or 4 big ones, 4 out of the 7 big ones, now see China as their preferred economic partner and preferred regional partner. So they are balancing the AUKUS, Quad, and other US geopolitical alignments in the region by deepening their economic and other cultural and diasporic integration with China, depending on which country you are in. ASEAN has always balanced in that region.
Okay.
They have always balanced. They have never allowed a single dominant partner to emerge. They have played all sides. Sometimes they have played themselves as well. So ASEAN are past masters at doing that. Now let's come to South Asia. We have been non-aligned. We built a non-aligned movement in the last century. We had 100+ countries come together and create a third space, not with Russia, not with Soviets, not with the Americans. We created a third space. By the way, that third space still exists.
Yeah.
And that third space is now huge. That third space is bigger in GDP terms than either of the two corners. So when you talk about a bipolar world, you are ignoring the fact that global GDP, global growth, and global dynamism does not belong to either of the two. So you can have a cold war with each other. We have a hot world that's growing and it's dynamic. So I think there is a third space that still exists in Asia, which is not going to be aligned at the corners. It is going to hold its form, and it's going to be more promiscuous because we have more agency. We will sometimes partner with China for certain issues. We will sometimes partner with the Americans. Sometimes we'll go alone. And I think that third space is really what has emerged in this century. In this century, 60% of global growth this year and many years from and henceforth for many years, 60% of global growth is going to come from the developing and emerging countries. And that is where I think the world order will find a reconciliation between these two extremes that we are trying to deal with. Pardon my saying so, a non-transparent China that is not willing to behave like a superpower, and the only superpower of the world, America, which does not believe it is one because it is more caught up with defining pronouns than defining the global political architecture. They're so caught up with their own inner ideological. So you mentioned ideology in the beginning.
Yes.
And I agree with you. Sorry, I agree with John. I don't think there is a, it was you actually. I don't think there is an ideological divide across countries. The ideological divide is within countries. And I think that is expressing itself in geopolitics. It is American domestic politics divided. It is the European countries who are facing divisions within their own politics. And it is that division within their own countries that is expressing itself in the choices they make in international relations. So I think it is the internal ideological divides that are more pronounced. As far as the world order is concerned, this is naked power play. China believes its time has come. It has a scheme for the world, and it is exerting itself. Americans don't want to cede space, and they're preventing that from happening. This is naked power play. I don't think there is any morality in this debate, or there's any ethics in this debate. They are amoral, both sides.
Okay.
And we have to hold the third space.
Thank you very much, Samir. And as you mentioned it, as they say also, all global politics is local. And this internal domestic divide actually shaped the geostrategic outlook. Now, Professor Xiang, I'll take it to you with the very pressing questions, maybe in the minds of so many. When we're talking about the illusion of stability and the world in flux and the perceived threat to the stability of this world order, China comes to mind, at least in the minds of the West, in the minds of the Americans. And for the last, at least decade, China been portrayed as being the coming threat to the dominant power, not only a revisionist state, but actually a potential threat to the dominance. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, what is order we're talking about? What the Americans or West in general, they're talking about order. They use the expression of rules-based international order,
Right.
which for me should be correctly translated as my way or the highway. It's my order, it's my rules. So if you don't do now, that's the first thing. It's completely misguided. And it's not even working today, especially, I would say, after this clear double standard demonstrates itself during the Hamas and the Israeli conflict. It's become so clear. Global South, I'm talking about global majority. There is no rules-based, or even the G7 has to admit. Okay. So this is one thing. I think it doesn't make any sense anymore. It should be banished. That for me, that phrase should be banished. The second thing is order itself. You see, Western concept about order is always based on a mechanical concepts, which is order is based. When you say stabilize order, they're thinking about power balance. Mainly hard power balance. This is a tradition I don't think is surprising. This is a tradition of a typical West,
Right.
I would say Westphalia, they call balance of power and so on and so forth. Now, Chinese view of order is not a mechanical view. Historically, Chinese have the order actually has a lot to do with containing the flood. You look at the word order itself with a water, Chinese characters image, you have to look at the picture. It really means how do you contain flood? So it's emphasized on stability. Don't let things out of control. Okay? Now, how do you do it? You have two ways to it. One, you keep on building dams, which is American love. The entire Cold War, they call containment, right? Remember strategy. But there is limits. You cannot keep on building. How high you can build that flood? Now, the more effective way to maintain order in Chinese historic view is to find ways to let water go. Follow the natural tendency. You see, this is what the order really means. Right. So this is where the difference here. So we cannot come to an agreement when we talk about order if you follow this American or Western view. Now, the last point I want to emphasize, why Americans are so obsessed with this, maintaining this mechanical order, that has to do with another Western tradition. That is a morbid fear of decline. This is, of course, starting with, of course, Edward Gibbon about the Roman Empire, that tradition, all the way down to, Toynbee, Paul Kennedy, but of course, the most importantly is Oswald Spengler. I will say current Western anxiety about China has a lot to do with Oswald Spengler's obsession about the decline of the West. So this is, I think, in my view, this is a psyche of the United States politicians, plus a racial aspect, okay? Yellow peril.
Right.
Nobody reads Spengler anymore, but we know his book on decline, but we have to read Oscar Spengler's last book before he died. It's about technology. Now, I quote what he said. Nobody read it anymore. 64 pages. He said, yellow or the colored people should never be allowed to command the technology because they're going to destroy white people's world. So for me, the current policy making, the rules of those policy making and psychology, for me, it's very, very historically relevant. Go back to these fundamental framework of thinking. Yes.
I'll continue with you.
Can I just make
Yes, go
short
ahead,
intervention?
Samir, go ahead.
One, I just want to clarify that colored people are doing well with technology. I mean, just so that we all...
And we have quite a few in the United States.
Exactly. So I think we are doing well. So let's not... so that's one point. But on a more serious note, I think, look, the previous speaker makes a point that you have a rules-based order stitched together by a handful of countries that were independent in 1945. Literally 4 times the number of nations today are independent and sovereign countries. So therefore, even if you were not to take the debate to the extreme as it was presented, you could still argue that those who were sitting on the table were insufficient to represent the world that exists today, and therefore that order that we are seeking to defend may not necessarily be worthy of that defense unless we reform it and tweak it and rewrite it substantially. For me, it is a perpetuation of the colonial project, because the colonial masters and their allies were sitting in the room defining the post-war order, and the form itself is jarring, and it requires complete revision. It requires new voices of today to be sitting. Right. But I take slight exception to the previous intervention by my colleague from Geneva. Look, it is not just the Americans who want to stitch the rules as per their needs. The last 20 years tells us that every time China has been given an opportunity to offer an alternative, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, or for example, the AIIB, or many of their infrastructure projects, they have been equally mercantilist and capitalist in their approach to those projects. Self-serving Chinese policies are also equally at fault. So I don't believe that power corrupts only one end of the spectrum. Power corrupts everyone. And I do not believe that there is a moral and ethical proposition coming out of Beijing. It is also equally driven by promotion and propagation of their own interests and power. And I think that's the only point. It's not, there's no one villain in the room. There are all of us who are equally implicated as we implement our policies. That's all I'm trying to say.
Samir, this is very exciting. And yes, power corrupts everyone in power, but almost everyone. I'm going to take it back to Professor Xiang before I come back to you, John, for very impressing and pressing issues. This Newton mechanic physics of your balancing powers, and not the quantum new physics in it, and when my way or the highway. So Chinese tried their own way, which is their own way or the highway, and they tried for long to provide an alternative to what we know as a rules-based system. It was not attractive at all. And, nations and states are not very fond of what the Chinese have to offer. So, what do you react to that? Professor Xiang.
For me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Well, I think for me, the most frustrating thing is the puzzle, the way the US or the West, particularly I'm emphasizing US because I live in Washington quite a bit the last couple of years. The think tanks are not doing much thinking. They're talking, they're competing who is more hawkish. Even that is losing value because everybody become hawkish, right? So, but then the way they talk about Chinese intention sounds to me is entirely without historical intuition or sense. There is no sense about history. When you say Chinese want to dominate the world, try to displace the United States, this is the predominant thesis in Washington. First, there is zero historic evidence the Chinese ever wanted it. The second, in practical terms, why they wanted to dominate the world. Remember, if you want to displace the United States, you have to take upon all these responsibilities. Hundreds of military bases, you have to be performing police of the world. You have to spend 40% of GDP. The 6% or 7% GDP on the military. You have to be obsessed with the military, the side of the competition. You have to keep ahead, which in the end probably are not good for the well-being of your own people. I have not seen any of those. Even in Beijing, I haven't seen this is the intention. Now, do they want to keep influence or maintain influence in the surrounding area? Who is not doing that if you are a great power for your own region? But say world domination, that kind of thesis is absolutely nonsense, okay? Then the second point is American argument about why we are getting tougher with China, because the Chinese did not keep their promise of becoming one of us. You see, that's another logic. Jake Sullivan said so clearly, because historical trajectory, 40 years ago, we thought, this is of course known as convergence theory. When China economy takes off, eventually their political system will become coming to us. Nobody reads Deng Xiaoping's speeches. Remember 1980 when Deng Xiaoping came to power, the reformer. The first interview with Italian journalist Arianna Fallaci. Go back to read it. And Deng Xiaoping said, I want perestroika. Never. Glasnost. We never want to change our political system. Well, how come you choke on your own vomit when saying you miscalculated China? Then you said, because of that, we cannot do this. So the logic is shockingly ahistorical.
Okay.
Maybe that's a typical American. Sorry, I mean.
Yeah, well, this is an
Sorry.
excellent point for another discussion, but
Yeah.
we have so many things to talk about it. Now, I'll bring it to you, John, and before we go to the audience taking some questions, and I would like you to provide your comments also about what has been said, but I have a question, particular one for you. So the rules-based system, it's a mere reflection of a balance of power at a given time. Balance of power changes, the system changes. That's what it is. And it's also a reflection of the dominance of certain value system. So it's not global per se. And that's what we've been trying to promote and claiming this is the word which it is. It's the rules-based system as we envision it back in the 50s after the World War, and then with all international institutions and finance and then the UN, its systems, et cetera, and national security. But that has changed. The world has changed, and the world moved to certain different domains that the existing system actually cannot accommodate it. So based on that and what's been said, how do you see the trajectory of this world? We know it is in flux, but if it is, to settle down at certain time, so how would that look like? I know it's a little of challenging question.
No.
I trust you can react to it.
So I think the world-based system, as I understand it, is premised on issues like transparency, anti-corruption, uh, the free movement of capital, the kinds of things that the United States brought European partners along with as it reconstructed Asia, was trying to advance. I don't think it's so much about domination as creating opportunities for dynamics, which the US doesn't actually control, but helps encourage. The US system isn't about state control and determining outcomes, and I think this is one of the things where the United States was systematically misunderstood during the Arab Spring.
Right.
It's not about who wins the election, it's the fact that you have an election, and then you have another election, and then you have another election, and through that you create a virtuous circle, and of course that's not what happened in 2011, and I think it's sometimes misunderstood. But the system is about creating a set of dynamics and a set of rules that allows for competition. I think that the Chinese system, as I understand it, as I've seen it, is about shaping outcomes, and it's about maximizing the advantages that accrue to China. The United States behavior in the post-Cold War world and in the Cold War world, I would argue, was never about maximizing directly for the United States. It was for creating a system where the United States and like-minded partners could compete successfully. I think we may be moving to a leadership in the United States which actually does try to maximize, which acts in a more Chinese way, which is less willing to take altruistic sacrifices on the benefit of the system and seeks to extract maximally out of bilateral relationships where the United States is the preponderant power. How that affects the system, how it affects countries like India, how countries try to adjust to that system, and how countries try to adjust to a system where US strategy can change more dramatically from administration to administration, I think is an important question. And when you combine it with changes in technology, changes in economics, which technology helps drive,
Right.
I think social and political changes, partly driven also by technology, I think that's why we are entering this very uncertain period. To my mind, the United States was constantly paying dues to sustain a system where the United States competed well, but didn't determine outcomes.
Right.
And I think we may be moving to a place where the US is less willing to pay those dues, which is going to insist on extracting more from others. And to my mind, that becomes a system where there's more experimentation, there's more uncertainty, there may be more conflict, and we might not have better outcomes either for the United States or for US partners and allies.
All right, thanks, John. I want to see, shall we go to the audience, or we have 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes, and then go to the audience. And
Can I make a quick point? I think.
yeah, I'm coming to you, Samir. Wait.
Okay.
It's just I wanted to check with Dr. Sam. So we do have 5 minutes. And this altruism things is, gets on my nerves, John. And the Americans not trying to maximize their interest. Chinese tried. Maybe we need to discuss it at a length. But the system now, there are changes. And Samir, that's where you need to bring your comments on what John says. Given the situation as it is today, Taiwan, Ukraine, the struggles and problems and challenges in Europe, Middle East, Iran, radicalization, non-state actors, financial challenges, and these technological advancements, these drivers of a great transformation that out of control, all of that, Samir, how with Trump now is in the United States, where are we going?
So, the single biggest transformation that is underway is technology.
Okay.
Let's be honest here. So whether you want to respond to climate, whether you want to respond to development issues, whether you want to have political advantages and military advantages, technology is perhaps that single space that is going to shape the future. And here is my take. My take is that the Chinese don't have a technology model to offer to the world.
Okay.
The Americans call it Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is deeply integrated with all parts of the world. The Chinese have not been able to mirror and put together a global offering that partners with technology centers around the world, there is a deep distrust because of the opacity of the Chinese system. The American system, we all criticize, we all hate, we all love to hate, and we all yet engage. Because as one of my colleagues and friends mentioned some time back to me, Americans, while being hegemonic and while being dominant, created an offering for the world where they allowed their own politics to be penetrated by you. So you can go and stand outside the White House and abuse their president. You can go to the television channels and criticize their policies. You can write on there, you can go to the think tanks and challenge their own decisions. So they allowed their democracy to become more open to all. The Chinese don't have any similar model. Technology requires trust, and the Chinese don't have a platform that promotes trust in China. I think it's not an impossibility. I'm not saying the Chinese can't do it, but I think if there is one thing that is missing right now is the deep distrust of the relationship between Chinese technology and the Communist Party of China. And therefore, even countries like in this region, whether it's in the Middle East or South Asia, when it comes to technology, we are all betting on US partnerships and not Chinese partnerships. And that is true. Right here in Saudi Arabia and UAE, in many other parts of West Asia, South Asia, and even ASEAN, you see when it comes to tech, it's the US that is beginning to create partnerships. And therefore, in the days ahead, unless the Chinese dramatically open their own way of engaging with the world, and it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it's likely to be American tech and American partnerships that are going to shape the future of the world.
Well, I can't agree more, unfortunately, but it is what it is. Now, Professor Xiang, to that, and I'm going to challenge Samir on that, because there's also an evident, clearly, that Chinese had made an extraordinary leap in technological advancements, especially the new technological outlets, which, if taken seriously and continued, of course, open society and open systems much better for advancements, it seems, most of the time, it's especially in historical terms. But Professor Xiang, how you react to that? The Chinese system wouldn't help China to thrive?
Well, on technology, I only want to say that small garden, high wall, that's American approach,
Correct.
is not going to work. First, two things. First, historically, there is no success story of block technological division, cross national borders. British Industrial Revolution is supposed to be able to dominate the world for a while, but look, all the key core technology leaked out anyway. Chinese used to keep the three major, as a national secret, that our technology to maintain trade advantage in history since the Roman time. That is silk production, porcelain, and the tea. But eventually, they were stolen. The tea was stolen by British, so they had the Darjeeling, So we know that. We experienced that. So we don't believe this is going to work. The second thing is they forgot about Cold War history when they're driving thousands of Chinese scientific minds who studied in the United States, driving them back to China, which is exactly that they're doing. The Chinese top scientists, because they persecute, discrimination now, very much. So they were coming back to China en masse these days. Their first generation responsible for our atomic bomb. It's 1964, don't forget. So what's called self-reliance principle was rekindled, which will, to me, I would say, release enormous energy for technological, plus authoritarian system has its own advantage of organizing these things.
Right.
So I don't worry about that.
And there are also
John,
the
look,
challenges, and there are also
I'm
the
in,
challenges.
because
that-
I have a question.
Yeah.
So
There are also
for 1
challenges.
minute.
People
Go
like
ahead.
Jack Ma seem to have come up against the party
Sure.
and have lost, and that disincentivizes people from seeing a future in China and developing in China, as Samir suggested.
Right.
Well, thanks, John. Well, it's been very exciting. Thank you all. Now we take it back to our audience here. I have names, so I have Sayyid Sajabur first, and then I think I have Salih al-Ma'aita and others. But I'll start. No, I only have Sayyid Sajabur. Yes, Mr. Sayyid Sajabur.
Is it working? Thank you. It's really a very interesting panel, and I appreciate everybody. I have two questions. First for Dr. Alterman, and that is the issue of legitimacy deficit globally for the US. Yes, if you are talking about international order, it is not just mechanic, it's not balance of power, it's not just technology, it is also a normative setting in which it seems the US is increasingly having a deficit, especially when we go to the issue of the Middle East, not just recent Gaza conflict, go back to the history of US involvement in the Middle East and double standard. So to what extent the US is aware of this fact, and to what extent it's going to manage and how? This is my question for Dr. Alterman. My second question is for Dr. Samir and Professor Xiang, and that is the reality of the Global South as a factor in changing or in shaping a type of new order. To what extent do you think Global South is a reality and is able to shape and to impact? Furthermore, is China considering itself as a part of the Global South, or it's a type of in-between? Thank you.
Thank you, Said. I have another question from Hassan Al-Hassan. Mr. Hassan?
Yep, thank you very much. I just wanted to challenge what seemed to be the panel's conventional wisdom that China has been unsuccessful at exporting its, let's say, digital model or forging international partnerships, and that the US, on the contrary, has created this open model that has allowed it to flourish and develop a global footprint much more easily. Now, how is that still true to the extent that, I mean, Bloomberg released an interesting infographic that looks at how China has done since 2015 to 2024 in 13 technology areas that they've identified under their own made in China industrial blueprint. And it shows really how over the past decade, China not only has caught up in many areas like robotics, semiconductors, UAVs, and many other areas of technology, but has also, if you look at the digital Silk Road that China has propagated under the Belt and Road Initiative, you clearly see a lot of success in creating partnerships, especially and including in this part of the world, not to mention the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others. Whereas what we see in the US is a tendency to go in the opposite direction. With export controls, the Gulf states' frustrations with obtaining access to US semiconductors, to US artificial intelligence technology, have become very well known now. So is that conventional wisdom still true? I mean, it seems that China has made a lot of progress. That's part of the reason why the Gulf states are facing issues in accessing US technologies, because the extent of which Chinese technology has penetrated into tech infrastructure in this part of the world. So is this conventional wisdom still true? Does it still hold? Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. One more question and back to the panels. I have Sterling Jensen.
Yes, thank you. My question is from your perspective of US, India, China, how would you say the great powers view the Gulf states in the emerging world order? Are they more than just gas stations? How would you think they would? What role do they play?
Thank you. Last question. Badr Al-Saif? Badr. You taking notes?
I need.
I lost
good morning.
track.
Good morning, everyone. My question is, I'm reflecting back on the different worldviews that we heard. I think what Dr. Zaid did at the beginning by having the specific one-word answers was quite prophetic, because the three speakers have kind of stuck to the different worldviews that they presented, aligning with the words they've presented, whether it's flux, rejuvenation, or danger, and it reflects, I see, the internal dynamics of their own countries or societies, whether it's the US, India / Global South, or China. Now, I'd like to challenge the speakers a bit by considering the worldviews of the other as drafting your own worldview. How would a world in flux be encountering one that sees danger or one that sees rejuvenation, and vice versa? How can we integrate these different worldviews together to move forward into a more stable world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Badr. Now, speakers, anyone want to start answering, reacting to the questions? No orders?
Okay, so let me try. So let me start with the last one. Let me walk in someone else's shoes. Look, I was trying to be different. I could have used both these words as well. So I don't think either of these words are not descriptive of the world we live in. We live in a world that we all know is dangerous, and my word reckoning actually, in many ways, indicated to the potential of conflicts and collisions. So it was not averse, it was not avoiding the word danger or the world in flux. It is a world in flux. I think we basically describe the same phenomena, and it was not necessarily from our vantage points. I mean, don't blame my country for my views, right? I mean, just telling you, my views are my own, and they don't reflect an Indian view on anything. So this is pretty much my own way of describing the situation, very similarly to my co-panelists. There was no However, I think you are right. Rejuvenation is happening at a time, at a backdrop of a world which is very, it's a dangerous neighborhood. It's a very dangerous place. The Middle East itself is a very dangerous place. South Asia itself has the unsettled questions in both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some other parts of the world. So we are living in a tough neighborhood. However, I believe we have always lived in a world that has had these challenges. And what we are witnessing now at this particular point of time is progress in spite of peace in many parts of the world. And I think that is really what is the silver lining, that in spite of everything that is going wrong, there is something that is still continuing to propel people to be optimistic, positive, and seek a better tomorrow. And maybe that optimism can be infectious and lead to greater peace across the world. And that's what I was focusing on, that there is a big constituency that seeks peace, that seeks a better tomorrow, and that can manage some of the eruptions on the sidelines. That was one. On the second question, I'm quickly going to finish all the questions. On China tech, I think that speaker is absolutely correct. Look, the last 20 years was all about China tech. It was all about cheap Chinese handsets in every hand in the global south and many other parts of the world. They also increased their proficiency in building technology, and even the high-end handsets and high-end electronics became made in China. I think that is not in contradicting what I was proposing. What I was proposing was that when we go into the age of AI and quantum and deep technologies that infect national strategies, security, and individual agency, countries are going to opt out of that China revolution unless Chinese create an offering that gives some degree of comfort and build a level of trust with those who they serve. These are not mutually exclusive. Chinese did very well, and hence everyone is concerned about China. Chinese did very well with creating telecommunication equipment, hence Huawei is now banned in many countries. The point I'm trying to make is that the Chinese will have to create tech diplomacy and will have to offer a new format of engagement if they want their technology of the future to have legs. And I don't think these are mutually exclusive, right? So I think it has run its course unless China changes the way it does. Gulf states, gas stations, that is 20th century conversations. Gulf states today are the dynamo of the new world order that we are talking about. When we talk about the global south, please believe me, the engines are the Gulf states. And it is not because they offer gas, it is because they offer innovation. They offer a new format for growth. They offer a new design for cities. They offer a new ethic for mobility. This city and the city adjacent to it and many others are migrant cities. They are cosmopolitan cities which have more nationalities than anywhere else in the world, and yet they live peacefully. So there's a new model of urban living, a new model of industrial living, a new model of economic living which they offer. So I think Gulf states and gas stations are 20th century conversation. This is the incubators of tomorrow's world. The Gulf states, this is how we in India view it. We are joined at the hips. India's transition from 4 trillion to 10 trillion is going to be powered by UAE. That's the way we look at it. I think UAE is going to be the architect in chief of our future, and I think many countries actually are betting on that. And last point was just one final thought to look. I think the US legitimacy question is a valid question. It has taken a beating, and that is why the world order is in the position it is in. They have lost legitimacy by certain actions, by their politics, and by their choices. For example, the differential positions in Ukraine versus in Middle East versus in African continent, 3 conflicts and 3 different positions, right? So legitimacy has taken a beating. But here is the counter question: which global power or actor has improved their legitimacy in the same time? Who has come out shining as a savior of the world in distress? No one. So till such time American power remains predominant, America will be able to play with the legitimacy question to its own advantage.
Thank you very much. Professor Xiang, John, anyone?
Please.
China
Okay, well, also start with the last question about the world fragmentation or can be reintegrated. I think it's at this stage it's going to be very hard because the bloc politics it's already been established, especially I would say under Biden administration, because it starts with the whole concept of defining the 21st century world international relations as democracy versus autocracy. That is, of course, a typical Cold War language here. Basically saying, you have one part is the good guys, the other part is all the bad guys, or axis evil. So this is, I think, that conception is making the world very difficult to reintegrate. But as Donald Trump has a chance to do this better, my sense is probably Donald Trump it's a good news in that sense. Not only shake up the American system itself, which is United States needed. The elite politics has to be shaken up. But on the other hand, that Donald Trump, he didn't do, well, he doesn't like a war. He hates ideology. And he doesn't give a damn about allies, meaning bloc politics. So for me, I would say, if I'm sitting in Beijing, I would say, what's wrong with Donald Trump? Okay, maybe we're going to continue a trade war. But personally, I doubt his 60%, a new version of Smoot-Hawley Act, 1930s, 2.0. I really doubt it's going to work. So.
Thank you. You want to add something, or?
Oh, yes, that's
about
the first.
The global south.
Yeah, global south. Well, everybody wants to join global south now. That's the funny thing. I even heard the Russians talking about this.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this is more a sentiment, I must say. China part of the global, of course. China loved to be. Remember during Mao time, Chinese Mao created a theory called the Three World Theory. Right? This is the 1970s, right? Superpowers of first world, capitalist West, and the Soviet Warsaw Pact, they are second world. The rest, what they call third world. China at that point almost self-appointed as we are the leader of the third world. Now today, what's interesting about the global south, not just economically interesting for China. Chinese been doing that already. Belt and Road, I don't have to explain it again. The global reach of Chinese economy. But the other point is global diplomacy here. Global South in China and Russia, they actually call it global majority. That's the new phrase they like to use, especially over this Middle Eastern conflict. It's become very clear. So in that sense, I think China certainly will continue.
Just a quick anecdote from 2009.
I'm running out of time. I have a question. I have to take it.
Quick anecdote from 2009 when we were beginning the journey of the BRICS. I remember Russia telling us in early days, don't bring the global south issues into the room. we are, BRICS is different. BRICS is North and South and developed and
Right.
developing. Don't talk about Global South. Today, Russia says we are Global South. I mean, I'm just saying it's a long
interesting.
journey.
All right, I'll take a question and then bring it back to you, John. And I have one last question from Mohammed Deshiri.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask whether we are witnessing some sort of decline of polarity in the world. That means nobody talk about unipolarity or multipolarity, but we are talking about, for example, dimensionality, multidimensional world, or, for example, multiphonic world or multi-voice order, or even we are talking about globality, that means multi-global world. Therefore, can we witness some sort of decline of polarity?
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Now, John, your time to answer this and reflect on the previous 5 questions. And you have plenty of time, almost 150 seconds. Take your time.
I have to say that I don't share the sense of distress that some of my panelists seem to have that the United States is on the brink of collapse. I think we're actually entering a period where the preponderance of power the United States has in terms of economics, technology, military power, intelligence, all those different components of national power, I think are going to be more directed toward US advantage, less interested in sustaining systems. Whether that works out well for the world, I don't know, but I don't think we're looking at a picture of American decline writ large. I think the world's perception is going to be, how do we constrain the United States broadly? Because the US really does, in terms of population, in terms of all the tools of national strength, I think that people will appreciate the ability of the United States to do what it wants to do, and the United States will be doing more under President Trump than it wants to do than it has in previous times. I'm also not concerned about this issue of the Global South broadly. I think what the Global South has become is it's become a sort of a veil for China and Russia to pull much of the world away from the United States, or to create a dichotomy between developed countries and less developed countries. But I think the United States actually is deeply plugged in to these countries. When I talk to people in the investment world, the banking world, they all want to engage with Americans and American institutions. And of course, we have these huge expatriate communities. The non-resident Indian community, for example, is just one example, but the United States uniquely in the world is plugged into all these countries that are trying to really transform. And I think that as we see this rejuvenation in much of what we might call the Global South, you will see that intimately connected
with America,
to the United States, to American institutions, American financing, American communities that bridge this. And I think that gives the United States a unique role, as Professor Xiang said, in China as well. And that's really different from the rest of the world. I want to talk to the question that Said Kazem Sajidpour raised about legitimacy. I think there is an extent to which the United States is committed to ideas like the inviolability of national borders, which helps encourage others to act in that way. It certainly helped Kuwait in 1990.
Right.
I think it described what the United States was doing in Ukraine in 2022. The United States doesn't support militias. It doesn't try to undermine politics. That's not how the United States operates. And I think that the legitimacy the United States has is because of the transparency in how it operates and the desire to create a system where states deal with each other as states rather than try to undermine each other. As I'm sure you've heard people talk about how the Iran controls 5 Arab capitals, none of which, in the argument of regional governments, is through legitimate means, and there's a concern about the way Iran has agents cast throughout not only the Gulf, but more broadly. I want to close on this issue of technology, because I think we may be at a profound inflection point in the way economies work, in the way employment works, in the way power works. We're putting arguably trillions of dollars into artificial intelligence. We don't know how that will play out, but I think if we're serious, we have to consider the possibility that the role of government may be profoundly transformed in 10 years, that the balance of power, the distribution of power in the world may be profoundly transformed in 10 years because governments that have access to AI will work completely differently than governments that don't have access to AI. The nature of technology is you never know how it's going to come out. You make a lot of bad investments and a few really good ones, right? Venture capitalists, if you're good 1% of the time, you're an all-star. And we're in this venture capital mode. But I think if we're serious about the future, we have to accept the possibility that we may be in a profoundly different world 10 years from now. We may be in a very similar world. We may not be able to muster the necessary regulatory framework to harness this. This may be the principal driver much more suddenly than energy transformed geopolitics in the 1940s. Technology may transform geopolitics, and we could be in a whole different world.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this very, very exciting, our distinguished scholars' discussions. Thank you so very much for your inputs, insights. I know we needed more time, but that was excellent enough. And thanks you to your audience. Thank you all.
Thank you.
سيداتي وسادتي، ستبدأ الجلسة التالية خلال 5 دقائق. سيداتي وسادتي، ندعوكم لاستراحة مدتها 15 دقيقة قبل بداية الجلسة التالية. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy a 15-minute break before the next panel.